Hello, I'm Dr. Vicky Baker. I'm a senior lecturer in gender-based violence based in the School of Nursing and Public Health at Manchester Metropolitan University. That's in England, in the UK. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about my doctoral research, which explored young people's own accounts of using adolescent violence in the home. So just a brief overview of the session. Firstly, I'm going to speak briefly about the rationale for the study, so why I felt it was important to look at this particular issue. Then I'm going to cover a little bit about methodology. Then we're going to dive into the findings. And first, I'm going to just briefly go over some of the types of behaviours that young people spoke about using at home towards their parents. And then I'm going to dive into kind of the main thrust of the session, and that is really exploring young people's own perspectives on the causes, contexts, and motivations for their use of violence and harmful behaviour at home. And then section 5, I'm going to do a deep dive into 3 of the main themes that I identified. And the 3 themes are power, control, and agency, communication, and anger and emotion regulation. And then once I've gone through those, I'm going to chat through just some of the practice implications based on those findings. So the rationale for the study. So to date, the research into sort of adolescent to parent violence and abuse has really been quite dominated by the accounts, experiences and perspectives of parents and practitioners. And that's obviously, it's important because parents are the main kind of victims of this form of family violence, and practitioners are sort of working on the front lines to really support families who are experiencing this issue. So it is vital to have their perspectives, but unfortunately, this seems to have come at the expense of young people's voices. And young people's voices are nearly entirely absent from the literature. There's only really a very small handful of studies that explore it, and really none that go into significant amounts of depth. And this is important because young people may construct why they use violence in a totally different way to that of parents and practitioners. You know, we're only really guessing that they might feel about it in the same way and construct it in the same way and frame it as parents and practitioners do. It's all kind of hypothesizing, really. So without speaking to young people themselves, without asking them what's going on for them, why do they feel like they're using these behaviours at home, kind of missing a really important piece of the puzzle, and sort of missing a really holistic, in-depth view of the problem. So I felt for this reason it was important to carry out a piece of in-depth research that really centred young people's voices and young people's perspectives on the issue. So the methodology that I chose to use, it was a mixed method study. So all of the methods drew solely on young people's perspectives. And when I say young people, this was young people aged 14 to 18. They were split across 2 main contexts, and this is in the main an education context, and that was a post-16 college. So students who have finished their compulsory schooling and they've gone on to further education. And then the other context was a youth justice context, so young people who were being supported within the youth justice system. And I carried out initially a self-report survey with 221 of these young people. And then I did a follow-up of sort of using in-depth interview techniques with 21 young people. And 13 of those young people reported using violent and harmful behaviour towards parents. And this was broadly equally split between girls and boys. That doesn't really represent the kind of prevalence that was seen in the survey, because as I'm sure you can understand, not necessarily everybody who identified that they were using violence in the survey then wanted to go and be interviewed. So that was our kind of, that was the broad split on the actual interviews. And it's important just to say that you can see there that the main kind of sample was actually 75% female, which is quite a unique sample, I suppose, for a study within this area. And that was mostly because the education context was actually a sociology course, and on that course it was predominantly female students. So that's a brief overview of the methodology there. So within the interview, so that's going to be the focus of the session today, kind of the findings from those in-depth interviews, and what sorts of behaviours were young people describing. So they described a range of physical and non-physical forms of abusive, or you could say harmful, behaviours at home, and that included physical violence, verbal abuse, emotional, psychological abuse. And by emotional, I mean kind of put downs, undermining, humiliating, those kind of behaviours. And by psychological, I mean more kind of coercive and threatening. And they also used kind of economic or material abuses or violence. Economic might have been stealing from the home, but also it might have been putting parents under pressure to give them money. And material abuse is really things like destroying the home or objects in the home, objects belonging to parents, but also objects belonging to themselves. And those kind of behaviours ranged from kind of lower level up to more severe violence. And you can see here, I've just included a quote from Penelope, that's a pseudonym. And she's describing an incident that she had with her mother, where she said, in the last straw, because I ran out of the house afterwards, I smashed her head against the wall. So there were some kind of reports of sort of some severe episodes with a background of kind of ongoing patterns of harmful behaviours. So that's just a brief look at the sort of forms the behaviours took. And I'm sure you probably won't be surprised that these behaviours are most often targeted towards mothers. In fact, there are only maybe 2 out of the 13 where it also involved a father or stepfather. But in nearly all cases, if not all of those cases, it involved violence and harm towards a mother. And I asked young people, interviewees, why they felt this was, why they felt that they were, they were violent and sort of using abusive behaviours towards mothers and not fathers. And the kind of responses they gave broadly highlighted that mothers were closer in proximity and availability. So they were kind of primary caregivers, they were seeing them more often. In some cases, this was because mothers were parenting alone, quite often in the wake of domestic abuse. They were also closer emotionally than they were with fathers. And they kind of said that there was more opportunities to clash because they were closer. And then thirdly, and I think really importantly, sort of centering the gendered nature of family violence that we know, mothers were safer targets. And by safer, they meant both physically and emotionally. So you can see here Ruth alluding to the fact that her mother was an emotionally safer target. So I thought that if I was horrible to dad, he'd leave for good and he'd never come back. Whereas in a really selfish way, I knew mum would stay no matter what would happen. But also some young people stated that they were physically afraid of their fathers, particularly where there had been kind of histories of violence, victimization within the home. So mothers represented these safer targets of abuse. So diving now into what some of those causes, contexts and motivations were. And just to say, this kind of really formed the bulk of the interviews where young people were really kind of hypothesizing as to why they were using these behaviours at home, and really, in most cases, delving quite deep into relationships and the dynamics and the emotions that were operating. So young people discussed a range of causes and contexts for their violence at home. And I'm not going to go into these all now, but it's just to say that I kind of felt it was useful to map these onto a sort of socio-ecological model to highlight that these kind of factors and dynamics really operate not just at the level of the individual. You can see there that inner ring focuses on things that were at the individual level or intrapersonal level. So things such as emotion regulation, substance use, mental health. They also it also involved things at that interpersonal level. So things that were going on in the family unit. So you have here experiences of domestic abuse, absent fathers, child abuse, and parent-child communication. So those were really quite centred quite frequently within the interviews. And then moving outwards, you have kind of causes and contexts that are going on at the community level. And most typically this related to bullying and peer violence in the community, but also environmental stresses that impact on the family unit. And then finally, moving into that outer circle, you have the kind of social and cultural factors. And the two main sort of factors that appeared within these interviews sort of centered around the gendered nature of parenthood, that being mothers being the primary caregivers and mothers being safer targets, and the gendered nature of family violence in general. So that meaning that quite often mothers were parenting in the wake of experiences of domestic abuse, and that young people, interviewees, had experienced a lot of victimization, and much of that was victimization from male caregivers or male kind of family members. So that's just a brief overview of the ecological map. And I kind of condense these through a thematic analysis. I condense these factors and contexts into 5 key themes that I kind of felt were kind of 5 key drivers. That was victimization and trauma, struggles for power, control and agency, stress and maladaptive coping, poor parent-child communication, and anger and emotion dysregulation. So these were the kind of 5 things that stood out to me as really feeding into the dynamic. And today I'm actually going to focus on these 3 themes. So power, control and agency, communication, and anger and emotion regulation. So we're going to do a deep dive into these 3 areas today. I think it's important to say at this point that although, you know, there were 5 key areas, these weren't separate. So those 5 themes, they were all integrated. They all intersected and reinforced one another. And it's just to give you a brief kind of example here. The victimization experiences did really underpin nearly all of the cases that I spoke to. And that's not to say that that's in all cases of adolescent violence in the home, but within this particular sample, a significant majority of those young people had quite often multiple victimization experiences and framed these as being quite influential in their use of violence at home. And in some cases, this was leading to sort of trauma and resentment. And then you can see here that moving out to the side, trauma led to struggles with emotion dysregulation, but also that trauma and resentment led to poor communication with parents. So you would have both mothers, quite often mothers and children, traumatized, and this was making it difficult for them to communicate effectively. And obviously emotion regulation and communication interrelate as well. It's very hard to communicate well if you're emotionally dysregulated. And then the combination of all of these things together was feeding into the violent and harmful behaviour and those kind of dynamics. So it's just really to highlight that none of these themes, none of these contexts and dynamics really were operating in isolation. There's not one thing to focus on. It's really the combination and the intersection of all of them that's kind of vital here. So we're going to get now into focusing into the deep dive of the 3 themes. The first being power, control, and agency. So young people, pretty much all young people within the sample spoke about issues around power, control, and agency. And And really, it was highlighted that parental control or parental attempts at control acted as a kind of key site of conflict at home, and a key, I suppose, instigator of particularly quite violent episodes, but like that ongoing struggle between them and parents. And quite often, this was kind of articulated as being their parents' expectations clashing with their developing sense of kind of agency, autonomy, their sense of feeling like they should be able to be more independent, and this being at odds with parental expectations around those things. And in this sense, and they articulated that their kind of use of violence was really a means of gaining power and autonomy within the home, and that's power that they kind of felt entitled to have, considering they were sort of teenagers. Now, the power struggles focused on two key areas, and those were privileges and responsibilities at home, and then space and movement. And we're going to dive into those a bit more now. In terms of privileges and responsibilities, and it was more around privileges, I would say, the majority of the information, but parents removing and withholding privileges was a significant kind of, I suppose, immediate trigger of kind of particularly physical violence, or the beginnings of kind of conflict that escalated. And this tended to focus around things such as wanting to watch TV and not being allowed to, use of mobile phones, and also things kind of consumables like having sweets, access to sweets and cigarettes. And kind of alongside this, or kind of tied into this, I suppose you would say, it seemed like there were real kind of physical and emotional dependencies. So I say physical, particularly in terms of sugar and nicotine. So there were some kind of physical dependencies feeding in, but there were a lot of emotional dependencies that kind of came alongside access, particularly, I would say, around mobile phone usage. And you can see here from Ruth, she talks about the first time that she was violent to her mother. She said that the first time the violence happened was that she took my phone off me. So I tried taking hers, because like, if you're going to take my phone, then I'm just going to take yours then. And then Jen, she said that if I've been in trouble, she'll come in and try and take my TV, and I'll be like, no, just leave it. I'll give it to you in a minute when I've calmed down. But obviously she'll want to get it. And you can see here, back to Ruth, she really highlights that her phone was her biggest comfort blanket. So it wasn't just that she wanted it for convenience or to contact friends, but that alongside this was a real emotional kind of element running through it. It was a comfort blanket to her, and that by taking it away, you're removing that comfort blanket. And interestingly, Ruth also articulated that it wasn't just the phone itself and having control over that it was what the phone represented to her in terms of the power hierarchy at home with her mother. And I suppose as a bit of background, it's useful to say that Ruth was living just with her mum. So her mother was parenting, was single parenting, and that was in the wake of domestic abuse, but also in the wake of Ruth having been sexually abused by her mother's previous partner. And she was saying that particularly in this instance, she felt like getting her phone back or taking her mum's phone off of her was a way of kind of leveling the hierarchy, because she didn't want to be at the bottom. Basically, she felt like it should be a level playing field with regards to the power dynamic at home. And she says here, trying to establish some sort of hierarchy and that she wasn't above me. And I did then ask her, why she felt she wanted this. And she said, because I want what every teenager wants, to go out when I want, to come back when I want, and basically to make my own decisions. So that was an interesting insight. So the second main area for sort of parental control was around space and movement. So young people's space and movement, and also the kind of, I suppose, the need for physical and emotional space as well. And that meant both in and outside of the home. And quite often this was, this related to a real increased desire to see friends, so to be social. And as you saw, as the sort of interviews were progressively older, so the older interviewees, as they had gotten older, that became much more of a feature of their lives and much more, I suppose, really centered within their life. And so that drive to want to have freedom to go out and see friends was then butting up against parents' expectations that that should be a controlled thing. So Jen highlighted this kind of need for physical and emotional space. She said, like, she doesn't leave me alone when I'm angry. I speak to her about, like, Mum, when I'm angry, will you leave me alone? Because obviously that's when something takes over me and my body will just naturally hit you and I don't want to. So leave me alone. But she doesn't. So really articulating that need there for having that physical and emotional space, particularly when kind of agitated and in a dysregulated state. And Pete spoke about this kind of sort of being frustrated and not having freedom of movement within the house. And he said, well, like 2.5 months ago, I went out just for a breather. The social worker said, don't let him back in the house. So they didn't. So I started kicking through the door and then my stepdad came out. So I go, let me in. He pushes me away from the door. So I smack him about 3 times. And then I go in the house and the police end up turning up, arrested me, and then taking me into care. So we can really see here in this example, and obviously from the fact that Pete's got a social worker and that the social worker is saying don't let him back in the house, you can see that there were kind of quite entrenched historic sort of uses of violence from Pete in the home. It's also important to say that his stepfather was also violent to him. I think that's a really important context to remember here. But that you can really see the kind of implications for young people. So he actually described how he had quite an aggressive and harmful arrest in that particular incident, and that then resulted in him going into care. And when I spoke to Pete, he was still in care and really not having a great time of it. He was in sort of residential care. You felt like he was really isolated and alone. So you can really see the impact and the negative impact that these dynamics can have on young people. So Penelope said, I think her and her mum, were having arguments and a hard time that month. It was a bit unsteady. And I think I was like, I'm going to move to my granny's for a bit. She was like, no. And that's what kicked the violence off, I think. So within the interviews, there are a number of young people who kind of attempted to create that physical and emotional space through either formal arrangements. And in the sort of case that I'm thinking of, the young person tried to get themselves taken into formal care arrangements. And through informal care arrangements, such as Penelope, who wanted to go and live with her grandma. And it was this constraining against this kind of constraining of this denial of this in Penelope's case that led to an extremely sort of violent episode. And, understandably, it's kind of tempting to sometimes think, oh, well, maybe her mum should have let her go. But within these interviews, obviously, we've always got to sort of be mindful of the fact that these mothers quite often were, they're parenting quite often alone in the context of sort of trauma, and also having been sort of subject to violence from their children for a long period of time. So those kind of parenting decisions that mothers are making have that whole kind of history behind them. So, but it just kind of highlights, I think, it's interesting that young people were trying to create that space, that emotional and physical space, because they said a lot of the time that, things had become so heated at home, it was impossible to communicate effectively, and that just creating some space would have helped help them to calm down, to cool off. So underpinning a lot of the accounts relating to power, control and agency were accounts of parents of strict and authoritarian parenting practices. And that meant that it was parenting that was overly controlling. It was harsh sometimes, and importantly, not age appropriate. So young people really had a perspective that as they were getting older, they should be allowed more freedoms, and that the parenting styles that they were experiencing were too constraining for their age. And we can see Penelope highlighting here. I think that she's just so strict. When I was 15, I had to ask to go on my iPad and plan within a week advance to go see someone when all my friends were going, hey, do you want to come out like that night or that day? And my mum would be like, no, you didn't plan it. And I'll be a bit frustrated because she's just not lenient enough. And I'm 15, 16. I would like more individuality and like more dependence on myself rather than having to rely on my mum for stuff, having to ask for silly, petty little things. So yeah, a real emphasis there of feeling like, you know, that they should be gaining independence, and frustrated that they're not allowed to have that independence. So that was kind of the overview of sort of the power, control and agency theme. And I think I just want to move back for a second. Quite often in the sort of child to parent violence literature, there's quite a lot of accounts of permissive parenting, so parenting that kind of lacks boundaries. And what was interesting is that that didn't really appear within the interviews. There weren't really accounts that kind of reflected that. It was much more around strict and authoritarian parenting, whether that's due to it being young people's perspective or whether that reflected the kind of true parenting practices is quite hard to say. But it was interesting that that wasn't reflected within young people's accounts. So moving on to the second theme, communication. So communication really, it kind of fed through as a kind of a linking thread through the various themes. So it acted as kind of a trigger in its own right, so poor communication, but it also kind of mediated and connected some of the other themes. So in terms of being an immediate trigger, parents shouting and raising their voices was discussed a lot. And parents using aggressive and hurtful language, but also there kind of being a lack of listening, a lack of kind of honest talk around emotions was also highlighted. And then lastly, I'm going to speak a little bit about how young people constructed their use of violence as a form of communication. So parents shouting and raising their voices was highlighted as something that really escalated conflict. And importantly, it really it deregulated, sort of dysregulated young people. So it really triggered their sort of anger and their kind of emotional dysregulation. So Dan here said, I just don't like people shouting at me and arguing with me. It just gets me really angry. And then Jen said, interestingly, it's not the stuff that she says, mostly it's how she says it, like shouting, go and do your pots. So, and this is one good example here of how the themes interconnect with one another. So you have here on the previous theme that I was saying around responsibilities. I didn't talk too much about that, but there were kind of a number of young people who said some of the conflicts arose when their parents wanted them to do things at home, like chores, and that they didn't want to do it. But interestingly here, Jen said it's not really being asked to do the chores, it's more the way that that communication is taking place. So we can see here the two themes interconnecting with one another. And then it's communication that kind of mediates that other theme. So yeah, and you'll kind of see that throughout these kind of interconnecting of the themes. And obviously you kind of, again, have to take this in in terms of understanding, you know, sometimes it's probably easier to be nice on asking someone to go and do the pots the first time, but maybe on the 10th request, it might become more agitated. And it's not to say that's definitely what was happening, but kind of important to sort of bear that potentially in mind. But definitely here, the kind of forms of communication that are happening were definitely sort of centered as really important for young people. A number of young people spoke about parents using aggressive and hurtful language, and that this kind of did two things. It damaged the parent-child bond, and it also impacted on their self-esteem and their positive self-regard. And here we have Ruth, who said, having your mum compare you to someone else, like to another person, and what they'd wish you to be like, makes you, well, to me personally, it made me feel like I wasn't enough. Almost felt like I was the broken child that just couldn't be fixed. I think that's why I kept hitting a brick wall of kind of like, why am I even trying? Why am I even trying? And I'll just give you a little bit of context here. I said already that Ruth had experienced sexual abuse from her mum's previous partner. So Ruth said she held a lot of resentment and a lot of blame towards her mother for that. And because she was experiencing a lot of distress around the trauma of that, the only way she felt like she could express that was by behaving in certain ways. So she said she did a lot of kind of going out with friends. She did a lot of substance use, and she kind of framed these as kind of symbolic ways of disclosing to her mother that she was feeling distressed. But unfortunately, because of her sort of father and his background, he had been quite abusive to her mother. He'd also used a lot of substances, and her mother would end up drawing quite negative comparisons between her and her father. And this really kind of ate away at her sense of self-esteem, and it really damaged that bond, and it made her feel kind of unloved and unseen and misunderstood. And this was kind of really feeding into that kind of child to mother kind of abuse dynamic that was going on. And she kind of really emphasized that here by saying, because I thought the more I was around my mum and feeling like she didn't love me, the worse I was going to get. So another area of communication that kind of impacted on young people and dynamic in a number of different ways was there not being kind of much listening going on in the home, and a lack of honesty and what I've termed kind of emotion talk. So there were a lack of open and honest discussions about feelings. And this resulted in young people feeling like they were unheard, like they were misunderstood. And really there was just that not that positive relational bond there, because it wasn't underpinned by any form of kind of authentic communication. And it led to kind of frustration and hurt in young people, which then kind of, you know, increased that kind of emotional volatility at home and really underpinned a lot of the interactions sort of moving forwards. And young people kind of explained what these kind of, I suppose, a lack of culture of family talk. The kind of explanations for why that wasn't there included a fear of reigniting arguments. There'd been no family culture of emotion talk at home, of both themselves and their parents taking defensive positions during interactions, a general reluctance to discuss difficult issues. And I'm sure, as you can imagine, the majority had some sort of shared trauma. And so these were very difficult issues to be getting to grips with, especially if the kind of emotional volatility at home is really high anyway. People are traumatized, are dysregulated. It's then very hard to have calm conversations about quite complex, sensitive issues. And that generally there was a lack of openness to others' perspectives. And young people didn't just put it all on their mothers, on their parents. They did kind of highlight it as being a two-way street. You know, some young people were saying, I'm just not a particularly open person. You know, I find it hard to communicate. So it was kind of a mixed bag in terms of those attributions. So Ronnie said, when we get into an argument, she doesn't listen to me, and then I don't listen to her, and we end up clashing. So a lot of young people spoke about that kind of that escalating model of communication. You know, someone doesn't listen, the next person doesn't listen, or someone starts shouting and raising the volume, and the next person goes even louder. So those escalating models were definitely in there. And Joe said, in terms of, you know, not wanting to talk about difficult things, I prefer forgetting about it, the violence, because knowing me and her, if we talked about it, we'd disagree on something and then it'd start again. So that real fear of reigniting past arguments did come up. And Pete said, in the house, like we just don't talk about what's happened, the violence. It's just something we don't do. So that real sort of a lack of a sort of culture of sort of emotion talk within the home was really quite apparent. And then Penelope kind of emphasised, and Penelope, it's important to say here that Penelope was kind of looking back. She was 17 at the time of the interviews, but she was really, I think, talking about when she was 15, 16, and she'd kind of successfully moved through that phase, which was really good to say, that she'd sort of come through that period of time and this dynamic was no longer going on at home. And it meant she had a very reflective and a very kind of deep appreciation of those dynamics that were operating. And she said that it was really such a communication barrier that was between us. And I think if we just learned to let that barrier down, let that wall down, and just sit down and talk more about everything, then it would just stop everything arising. So a real sense of there being a communication barrier, and that actually for the young people who had moved past this, and that tended to be those I was speaking to who were older, that actually once communication was re-established, and things had to be put in place for that to happen. For example, you know, some deep therapeutic work. But once that communication was in place, that really started to lay the foundations for that healing, and that being able to move forward in a healthy way. And Ruth stated, in terms of violence as communication, so a number of young people spoke about how their use of violence, their kind of, and you know, I don't just mean physical violence here, but their kind of use of harmful behaviours at home, in a lot of cases were them trying to disclose, trying to draw attention to the fact that they felt extremely distressed. It was their way of coping and communicating in a context where they didn't feel they had the words to do that. And Ruth said, I wanted her mother's attention. I wanted dad's attention at that. I didn't want the whole world to know. I just wanted my family to know how I felt. And the only way I felt like doing that is something they didn't really understand. They don't really understand mental health too well. And the only way I could make them understand was just by acting up. So yeah, Ruth really highlighted this kind of these behaviours as being quite symbolic attempts to disclose. And I think it's important to say here as well that Ruth and Penelope had both attempted to take their own lives, and they kind of cited this harmful dynamic that was going on at home as being quite integral to that, integral to their sense of self, their sense of positive self-regard, and that they felt like people would be better off without them. So I suppose it really just highlights the severe impact and ongoing impact that this form of family violence can have. So now onto the third and final theme that we're going to deep dive into, and that was young people's anger and their emotion regulation. So interestingly, citing anger and a lack of emotion regulation as a cause for the violence was actually very common by young people, and quite often had to kind of dig a little bit deeper. You know, why was it that you were angry? Why did you feel dysregulated? Because it's not necessarily a reason per se, a cause in of itself, but it is useful because it highlights what I suppose is the most immediate emotional aspects of the dynamic that's going on for them. But interestingly, those young people who really centered kind of, oh, it's because I was angry, it's because I was had poor emotion regulation, not that they'd use that terminology, but losing control of myself tended to be what they said. That was kind of those narratives that were created around that. Quite often it was kind of letting them off the hook a little bit, like, well, when I get really angry, I totally lose control. Like Penelope says here, violence was because I was over the top angry. It's just that if I get angry and cross the line, I can like lose control of myself. And those kind of narratives tended to be quite a blaming of mothers. Oh, it's because she caused me to lose control. I'm like, when I'm that angry, I can't be held accountable for my behaviours. So it's quite interesting that this particular theme, this particular cause in young people's minds quite often meant that they didn't really have to take accountability for their behaviours. And this is one of the areas where you can see some similarities to the accounts of domestic abuse perpetrators, sort of adult male domestic abuse perpetrators. Now, there are a lot of differences in the dynamic. Obviously, the kind of power differential between adults and children within child-to-parent violence is much different. But it was quite an interesting kind of crossover. And Jo said, I get to the point where I just have to hit something, and she's just there because she's in the way when I'm angry. So a real kind of intersection there. You've got the kind of the gendered nature of parenting. It's mothers, they're in the way, they're close in proximity. She's in the way when I'm angry. So about kind of being dysregulated and not having the space and to be able to regulate yourself. So a real kind of interaction there with all of the things that we've been talking about so far. But again, shifting that blame to mothers. Now, alongside the themes that we've kind of talked about, kind of the reasons for anger and dysregulation, which included things like, poor communication, those issues around negotiating power and control at home. Also, we haven't really talked a lot about it in this session, but those kind of stress factors that were going on, those were kind of the main kind of, I suppose, contextual factors that were leading to anger and dysregulation. But alongside that, young people also spoke about having angry personalities, that they were immature when they were losing control. And quite often this was obviously older adolescents reflecting back, that their experiences of trauma really led to struggling with anger and emotion regulation, particularly contexts where there had been sort of severe peer violence. And one young person spoke about how she was constantly on edge, constantly looking over her shoulder and constantly feeling sort of dysregulated. And so she was always starting kind of up here rather than down here. And then a few young people spoke about the role of neurodivergence and particularly ADHD. So Ronnie said that some of the issue was because, especially when you're younger, you're full of all sorts of emotions and like you don't know where to put it. And really usefully, Ronnie spoke quite a lot about the importance of having a confidant. So someone that she could speak to, someone like a youth worker, so someone that wasn't a teacher, wasn't a parent, someone who's dedicated just to listening to her story, that she could go to. She could tell about how she was feeling. She could ask for guidance around having conflict with parents. She really kind of emphasised the importance of that. And a number of young people kind of spoke about this need for a confidant who's just dedicated to hearing their side of the story. And Jason spoke about ADHD, but sometimes it does wind me up a bit because I've got ADHD and I'm a bit, do you know what I mean? Just gets you a little bit angry. Like if I'm having an argument, like I just switch, like I get dead angry pretty fast. And interestingly, a number of the young people kind of constructed their violence as being a way of them letting off steam. And in this case, Jason was talking about when he'd been destroying his bedroom at home. So he said, at the time, I was angry and upset. But when I'd smashed everything up, I just had that relief. It just calmed me down. And similarly, Jo says, yeah, I've punched walls. it calms me down. And there was this kind of sense of young people being justified in their actions. I think Joe was saying to me, well, it's better that I punch the walls than I punch my own mother, which to a certain extent is true. But what we know in the literature is that for mothers experiencing this form of violence at home, having someone in the house who's destroying things and smashing things up, it's very upsetting and agitating, and it can make you feel like, am I next, essentially. But for young people, it had this real function. And throughout, they were kind of, the behaviours that young people were using tended to have functions. That's not to say they're justifiable functions, but that, they were either communicating something or they were helping them to let off steam. They were acting as a way of, targeting blame towards mothers. So all of these behaviours had a kind of function to them. So that's sort of a deep dive into those three themes. And I just wanted to tease out before I finish up just some of the practice implications that I kind of feel come from those insights. So for me, one of the biggest things is for practitioners is appreciating this issue as involving a range of complex interrelated dynamics. So the factors and contexts, and I've tried to highlight these as I've gone through, but they were always intersecting and reinforcing one another. So you couldn't just take out one, it's really quite difficult just to isolate one and address it, and then that be the kind of fixing the whole picture. And obviously, when you're sort of working with families, you can't address everything at once. So things do have to be taken to a certain extent, one step at a time. But I suppose it's understanding, it's mapping out at the beginning, all of those relational and environmental dynamics, and importantly, the historical dynamics and events that are feeding in to this issue, and really mapping that out so you have an understanding of where those interrelations are. So it's like, oh, okay, you're feeling really angry. Is that about communication? Okay, well, is that about any sort of historical events that might have been happening? So it's kind of really trying to map out, all of the various contexts. And importantly here, making sure that that's drawing on the perspectives of multiple family members. So the young person that's using these kind of behaviours, the parent that's, victim to these behaviours, and obviously there might be the young person who is a victim of violence and victimization as well. So really important to get as many perspectives as you can. Even siblings as well that are within the home will have a take on the dynamics that are operating in some of those historical kind of events and contexts that are underpinning some of these issues. And as I've said, the behaviours typically do serve a function. So by understanding the functions that the behaviours serve, you can hopefully implement healthier kind of alternatives. If someone needs to let off steam rather than punching a wall and destroying things, it's finding other ways, other healthier ways for them to do that. If they're using substances or destroying property to say that they're distressed and to get attention because they're feeling distressed, then it's helping young people to try and communicate and have the capacities to communicate with parents and with specialist workers about this issue. And then lastly, centering family communication. As I've said, poor communication on multiple levels often mediated a lot of these dynamics. And it wasn't just about the young person's communication, it's about the family's communication as a whole. So it's really important to build up both the individual and sort of both parent and young person communication capacities, and ensure that these are kind of brought up together. And that could be done separately and then brought together through something like family therapy, where that communication can start to take place in a healthier way. But what we kind of are seeing through the findings is that really underpinning, issues around communication are histories of trauma, being emotionally dysregulated, and also some of the parenting practices, those kind of harsher parenting practices, those more constraining parenting practices, as really triggering those kind of that dysregulation, and that really then hampering healthy communication. So that's what I mean when I'm thinking about mapping out all of those interconnections, is really trying to kind of tease out where we need to kind of invest the resources in order to kind of unpack the issue that's being experienced in the home. And I cannot kind of emphasize enough the important role that therapeutic support has in this, and that can really help to nurture the communication. A number of the young people spoke about having individual therapy, quite often to address victimization experiences they'd had, and then coming together and having family therapy, which really helped to just increase that kind of nurturing communication and helped them to move forward in a really healthy way together. And importantly, it meant both young people and from their reports of mothers, everyone kind of feeling heard. So everyone's got their own separate confidant to feel heard, to hear their story, and then they're coming together and able to move forward, together as a family. So those are the two. There are lots more kind of practice implications really, but those were the two biggest ones that I felt stood out from those particular three themes that I focused on. So I just want to emphasize that this webinar was based on insights from the following two publications. This paper at the top, so Young People's Accounts of Their Violence and Abuse Towards Parents, Causes, Contexts and Motivations. That really goes into a lot of depth around not just the three themes that I've discussed, but the five full themes. And if you want sort of more in-depth information about those and also about my methodology, please do go and read that paper. You can also get in touch with me if you haven't got access to that paper. But if you're actually really interested in reading the whole dissertation, the whole doctoral thesis, you can go and find that, and that's available at Holes in the Wall on my profile, and I've linked to that there. So, you know, these were my understanding of what I think the practice implications are. I'm really interested in, you know, understanding, you know, as practitioners, what you think the practical implications of these findings are for you. I can only take the findings so far. It's kind of over to practitioners really to take them the rest of the way. So yeah, any insights that you have as practitioners, please do feed them back to me. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and your perspectives on that. So yeah, thank you for listening to me today, and I look forward to hopefully speaking to some of you in the future.